The first presentation is titled Towards the Future, Growing Flowers and Cultivating Communities. Presenter is Dr. Robert Kading, new UH College of Tropical Agriculture and Human Resources, Assistant Extension Agent for Floriculture and Nursery Crops. Dr. Robert Kading is an avid orchid grower. Robert encountered many orchid pest and disease problems. The lack of information about these problems was the impetus for his study of orchid pests and diseases at the University of Florida, earning a Master of Science in Entomology and a Doctor of Philosophy in Plant Pathology. Part of his time as a graduate student was spent at the Tropical Research and Education Center in Homestead, Florida, where he worked with many of the orchid growers in South Florida to solve problems and assist with the implementation of integrated pest management techniques. After a postdoc at the USDA in Beltsville, Maryland, Robert moved to Oregon, where he has worked in plant disease diagnostics for growers mainly in Oregon, Washington, and the Idaho area. Everyone, here is Dr. Kading.
Thank you. So I'm happy to be here today, and I've been on the island now about 2 weeks, still getting adjusted to traffic, getting adjusted to the very humid weather. But I'm getting there. I'm finding that I can sleep now without air conditioning. At first, I thought I was going to die, but yeah, I was living in eastern Oregon. I don't know if you've ever been to that area, but it's very, very dry. We get a few inches of rain a year. All the agriculture is irrigated. So there was practically no humidity. So yeah, I'm getting there. But mainly today, I want to talk a little bit about me, who I am, where I came from. A lot of you I don't know, I haven't met. You may have seen me around and not know who I am. Just to give you an idea of who I am and what I would like to do in the future here. So I did my undergraduate work at Indiana University, and I just noticed that Tracy was at Purdue. So yeah, where I studied Near Eastern languages and culture, plant biology, and piano. Yeah, there's a lot to learn in the world, you know, and I took that opportunity to learn everything I wanted. But then after that, I went to University of Florida in Gainesville, did my master's in entomology. I worked with Marjorie Hoy. I don't know if any of you know her. I know at least one of you does know her. But we worked on a lot of orchid problems. She was an orchid grower too, and we just hit it off. Did a lot of orchid work, developed some new control for scales I'm going to talk a little bit about. And at the same time, I went ahead and did my PhD in plant pathology there with Aaron Palmatier, who is the ornamental pathologist in South Florida. So I split my time between Gainesville and Homestead, which is a little south of Miami. One of the things I did as a grad student there was go around and visit growers. There wasn't anyone really working on orchid disease in Florida, and there were a lot of orchid growers and they were having a lot of problems. So my committee said, why don't you go out, just go around to growers, see what's going on, and get an idea of what projects to work on. So this is what I did, and this is how I came up with the different parts of my dissertation, was going to growers, talking about their problems, and then integrating all that into a rather odd dissertation, I will say, because one chapter was insect, one chapter was plant bacteria problems, one was developing new molecular diagnostic techniques, one was developing some media to grow fungus that was difficult to work with, and then there was a whole chapter on developing extension materials with all of this stuff. So it was a very, very interesting dissertation, and it was actually a lot of fun. But I also worked in the diagnostic lab there in South Florida and got to see a lot of tropical ornamentals coming in, going out and working with growers. They would come in with a problem and say, well, I've got some sort of a strange fungus all over my greenhouse. I don't know what to do. Then I would go out and visit them, and maybe we would redesign the greenhouse, move things around, and then I continued to go back and evaluate how these things worked. And it was really great working with growers because I learned a lot. I learned that they know what they're doing. They are willing to frequently try something new if you're willing to help them get through that problem. So that was very interesting. I worked with growers from North Florida all the way down to South Florida. I honestly don't know how I got a dissertation written, because probably 60% of my time was driving around the state. Another thing I was required to do was to take all this stuff that I was learning and turn it into extension publications. So that was great experience. A lot of graduate students don't get that kind of experience, so I was thankful. And then all that then got worked into that chapter on extension. Mainly orchids. As she mentioned, I have been growing orchids as a hobbyist for probably 30 years. So I knew about orchids, I felt comfortable working with orchids, and slowly expanded into other areas like anthuriums, green foliage, a lot of other exotic ornamentals and palms. So just an example of some of the things I had to deal with. I had one grower call and say, we have a problem in the greenhouse, and can you come by and look? They'd been calling all over the University of Florida to try to get someone to come out and look at it. No one felt that they had any experience to do that, so somehow the message worked its way to me, and with the blessing of my committee, I went out and looked. And I was not prepared for what I was going to find. There were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of plants, these vandas, that had been imported from Thailand that were just covered with a bacterial disease. And it was so aggressive and it was so fast that we just kept pulling plants out of the greenhouse, pulling them out. And as most of you, I'm sure, know, bacterial diseases are almost impossible to control once they take off. But I was a student, and I was the one that could do it. You know how it is when you're a student. So I said, well, why don't we just, I'll keep working on this and we'll see what we can do. And it took several years, but we kept pulling them out. The big issue, turned out, was the import process. A lot of these were coming in and they were not quarantining them. I eventually convinced them to start quarantining plants that were coming in to their facility. And I don't know, about a year later, they called and said, we've built our quarantine facility. We want you to come down and look at it. Oh, I was so happy. So I drove down, and it was just an addition onto their greenhouse. And there was no separation. There was nothing separate about it at all. And I said, I think maybe you misunderstood what the goal was. And they were convinced it was going to work. Oh no, it's separate enough. It's, well, I don't think so. I think you should still try to quarantine these plants. Well, the next year it happened again. I stopped, and this was in Central Florida, on my way back to South Florida, just to see how things were going. And things were going great. They said just no problems at all. So I drove back to South Florida. 6 hours later, I got a call. Oh, Robert, we've lost half of our plants since you were here, 6 hours before. And I could hear over the phone the leaves dropping in the greenhouse. So this was the first really hot day in about a year. And of course, this turned out to be one of the new Dickia species. Used to be Erwinia, used to be Pectobacterium. But it will be latent. And that very first hot day, it took off, and they lost probably 80% of their plants in a few hours. So I went back and we built a quarantine facility with separate water, not as far away as it would like it to have been, but this was really all they could manage. So they built this quarantine facility, quarantined their new plants coming in for a year before they will move them into their regular facility. And this has almost eliminated the problems. They will still, every now and then, get a few that will come in with this soft rot, but they're able to remove it before it goes into their main facility. Something else we found was in Thailand, when they were shipping them, to fit them in the box, they would cut all the roots off and then spray them off to make them nice and clean, and then pack them. And they had this pipe that would go right down into the canal, and they would just spray this dirty water all over these plants and then pack them in these nice moist chambers. and send them to the U.S. And that's probably where part of the problem came from. But we did speak to that exporter, and they stopped doing that. And this grower was willing to pay extra for larger boxes, less plants per box. So, you know, they were really willing to make some of these changes. And fortunately for them, it worked. They've been doing very well still to this day. A lot of their plants go to Universal, where they use them in the landscape, some of the large hotels in New York. So they're doing well. That was a moderate success story. They still don't do things quite the way I think maybe they should be doing, but they're doing okay. Another problem I encountered was a terrible, in another facility close by, problem with scales. And these are really problematic because you just can't sell these plants. You know, with ornamentals, you can't have any problems. There's really no threat. The thresholds basically are zero. No one wants to buy a plant, or they shouldn't, with any insects, with any disease on it. And these plants were just unsellable. And I went and looked at these, and she says, well, I don't want to use any chemicals, any harsh chemicals. You know, I've had health problems, and I want to conserve my natural enemies and my frogs and my spiders, and so what am I going to do? So we found that silhouette. Anyone familiar with silhouette? Marjorie Hoy had worked on this with the citrus psyllid, and we said, well, why don't we try this with some of these pests of orchids? And we tried it, and it worked very well. We would use, I think, 0.1% silhouette and spray, and it completely eliminated them. And even would just remove them off the plant. So you could spray them, and you could see them kind of turn blue, where the water would infiltrate the scales, and then they just drop off. So I actually treated her entire greenhouse myself. It took days of walking around with this hand sprayer, spraying. You have to spray underneath and everywhere along, but it worked very well. But these are just a couple of examples of some of the problems I encountered when I was in Florida. And we did publish some nice extension publications from that work, and I got some good feedback, and people in Florida are still using this and having really good success with it. So after Florida, I graduated, and yes, I was at the USDA, but I was working on a cooperative research and development agreement with Carey's Nursery and Twyford International. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with Carey. Some of you probably are, but at the time he was in charge of a huge orchid production facility in South Florida. Has anyone been there and seen that place? I mean, of course it's not there now, but it was something to see. All automated. You know, the little orchid seedlings would come in and they would be planted, and they were never touched again by human hands until they were blooming size, ready to be packed. They would move through this giant greenhouse on conveyors that treated them how they should be treated at the appropriate size to get them to blooming size in 7 months. So it was pretty amazing. But I worked in a new area, and that was in biotechnology for Carey. When he initially approached me, he had been a great supporter of my research as a student. Anything I needed plants, I needed pots, he was willing to supply me with that material. So I thought that he was going to have me take a job in his growing facility. So, you know, this at the time was my goal, was to work in the orchid industry somehow. So he calls and he says, well, I want to have a meeting and talk to you about a job. And I was so excited. I don't think I slept. But I was, you know, ready to take that job. And he said, well, I'm going to be starting this new area, and we're going to be developing vaccines, and we're going to be using viruses. So I would like you to head that division, and you will go up to the USDA, and you'll work there with Rose Hammond. I'm sure some of you probably know Rose. You'll work with Rose Hammond and developing some of these virus vectors and see what we can do with it. So I took the job, and it was a lot of fun. It was difficult, but we did develop several virus vectors that we could basically put in instructions for making a protein. And then we actually used Phalaenopsis to make those proteins for us, and then would pull that protein out. So we have filed the patent for that, and then he went bankrupt and closed the company. So his entire growing facility is gone. I visited there a couple years ago, and I just couldn't believe it was massive, massive place. But he never recovered from that economic downturn. And it was after 9/11. People just stopped buying ornamentals, and he was, making maybe a penny per plant, and he had a difficult time. So unfortunately, he did go out of business, but the patent was filed, and I'm not sure whatever came of it, because I don't think they had the money to proceed with testing, human vaccines, and there's a lot of money involved in that. So, but I did work with Rose, and I learned a lot there, but this job came open in Oregon, and it was going to give me the opportunity to go back and work with some growers, which is something I really missed. In the job at the USDA, there was really no interaction with growers. I wasn't really solving grower problems. I was working on a different kind of problem than I really wanted. So I took this job in Oregon, and it was very dry. I think I mentioned that. Everything's irrigated. But the growers out there are pretty massive. And some of them, the farm will go 35, 40 miles long. They're just enormous farms. But my big job there was running the diagnostic lab and working with growers on a daily basis that would come in with a problem. So we would come in and say, I don't know what this is on this plant. We've got 20% of our plants in the field look like this. What is it, and what do we need to do? So my job was then to solve that problem, then relay that information back to the grower. And frequently they would have consultants that would not need chemical advice. So the big part of my job was working with the growers to quickly and accurately solve their problem so that the treatment could be applied as fast as possible, because time is money, as you all know. So do a lot of routine diagnostics. We relied heavily on molecular stuff, which I really loved just because it was so fast. We expanded in the time I was there from 1 thermocycler to 8, 3 real-time machines. All of this supplied by growers. I would contact a grower and say, hey, we really could use another real-time machine. Well, how much do you need? I need 18,000. All right, we'll send it over. I mean, they were really willing to help support the lab because of the benefit they receive from the lab. So a lot of soil pathogen detection I did there, and a lot of alfalfa for export to China. China has all these rules about exporting, and that was very difficult to work with. Very difficult to deal with the new regulations that were coming up all the time. Then the GMO regulations popped up, and then they found GMO alfalfa in Oregon, and all the shipments were being destroyed upon entry. It was a nightmare. But you learn a lot from dealing with these big problems, and you learn how to get through those big problems. So I didn't get much sleep for about 3 months when I was dealing with that. But another big part of my job there was to develop new diagnostic techniques when needed. Sometimes a traditional technique just was not fast enough. If you were submitting a sample to me, and I would tell you, well, if you could pay $30 and I could have the results for you in maybe 2 weeks. Or you can pay me $60 and by the time you get back to your farm, I'll be done. And they frequently say, just do it as fast as possible. I don't care what it costs. So I continue to develop the new techniques, faster techniques, just to get them their results as quickly as possible. Frequently they would have sprayers waiting. They would have a helicopter waiting, and they're idle, and they're paying them to wait, and they don't want them to wait. So as quickly as you can get those results and get to them, the better. So I mainly worked in potato. I don't know what you know about the Columbia Basin, but it's mainly potato, wheat, alfalfa, things like that. And I liked it because potatoes have so many problems. It's a pathologist saying that. There are a lot of problems, and every variety of potato looks different. And when you're dealing with some of the viruses of potato, the symptom in the tuber is identical, but all these viruses are spread differently. One's a nematode, one's spread by fungus, one's spread by aphids. So you really have to know which virus it is. in order to control it properly. So it was a lot of fun working with all those things. I still did some work with ornamentals, but it was mainly through just publications and doing some extension stuff. Like I've been publishing the last year or so in the journal Phalaenopsis, just to kind of keep my hand in the orchid world. I didn't want to completely separate from it, being so isolated out there. I mean, really isolated. That's why maybe I won't have a problem here, because we're isolated here, but you're surrounded by a sea, but there you're surrounded by a desert. And for me to even say if I needed to go to the grocery maybe an hour, so we were still isolated. So for me, I don't really feel isolated here as I was isolated there. If I wanted to order something through Amazon, it still took, days to get it, and then it was always late. So, it's not that much of a change for me. So here I am now on the Big Island, and I want to talk a little bit about where to begin. As I've been here 2 weeks now, today is the end of my second week. And basically, aside from getting the office set up and getting the computer and all these things, I've been talking to a lot of people, been talking to a lot of growers, and so far have visited a few. And it's been really good. I like what I'm hearing from people so far. But I'm in the middle of working on the questionnaire, and the growers that are in the room, it is extremely important that when you receive this, that you answer it and submit it. Because what you tell me is going to dictate what problems are going to be worked on. So if there's something really important that you want to see done, or you want me to do, it's important that you let me know. I want to learn about what you're doing now, and I want to find out what you would like to see done in the future. If you could have anything you wanted, what would it be? It's also important just to get to know the growers, so they'll know who I am, and build a relationship and build trust. And I understand that that's going to take a little while. I went through that in Oregon. First day on the job, the guy walked in the room. "You don't look like you know anything about potatoes. What do you know about potatoes?" And it was really difficult to work with some of them, but I won them over. You work hard and you put the growers' needs first. I think that's what you do, begin to build that trust and that relationship. They also knew they could call me at any time. Maybe that wasn't the smartest thing, but I think it really helped, because if they were really upset, they'd call me at night and say, "Robert, I don't know what to do about this." And I would be able to talk to them and say, "You know what, in the morning, this is our plan, this is what we'll do," and would take care of it. But just building that trust and that relationship. I want to schedule as many farm visits as possible, and I've already done several. But as many of you, the growers that are here, if you would like to schedule a time where I can come and see your facility, and I have my appointment book, I brought it. So I'm kind of old-fashioned. I don't like to do things I like to write it in an appointment book. I have it with me, you can schedule it. I have several scheduled next week and the week after, but can always be worked in. And so far, this is very preliminary, but what I'm hearing so far consistently from the growers that I've talked to is here's what they want. More information about arthropod control, so that's insect and mites, and disease management. And that really doesn't surprise me. Going through some of the records from previous years pretty much echoes what's on the previous records, and even in Oregon and even in Florida, it's the same thing. Those are the main things that the growers are worried about. And new plants, new crops. I'm hearing a lot about that. And I've already got some good ideas, and I want to talk to Tessie about later, but I think there may be some options. But to become an active member of the community so that the growers understand that they can call me anytime and I can go visit them and help them through problems is my main goal. Now, Penny, this is really strange, but it was really important for me at the time. So when I arrived in Hawaii, I had a little bit of a layover in Honolulu. And I went to this little restaurant and I had this server named Penny. And I was sitting there and I said, "Penny, I just arrived. What's your advice for someone new to Hawaii? The most important thing." And she said, well, really the most important thing is that you build a community. You build a community around you, you build a community of friends, of neighbors, of business associates, and that's how you succeed here. So those words really stuck with me, and that's my goal, is to build a community of growers that I can be a part of, and I can then assist them through their problems. Now, the next time you hear this talk, there'll probably be a lot more stuff here. But so far, this is what I have after about 2 weeks. So, this is my current contact information. I just thought that was really cool. The little orchid growing in that lava, I don't know. I know people are annoyed by these orchids, but I think they're just beautiful, and they're everywhere. Everywhere, but they're so pretty. You know, people on the mainland would go nuts over this if these were growing like this everywhere. Oh, you'd have car accidents where people would be stopping and taking photos everywhere, but they're great. Okay, does anyone have any questions for me? Like I said, contact me if you want me to come and visit. Can schedule it any time. Yes?
What growers, what type of growers have you been visiting? What were they growing?
So I visited a few that were very diversified. We grew everything from the tuberose for leis to hydrangeas to dahlias to orchids, anthuriums. Then I have about 6 this coming week that are also very diversified. So yeah, those are the main ones so far. Okay, thank you.